We ended the last video with the Spartans dominating most of mainland Greece. They controlled central Greece with a garrison right in the heart of Thebes. And of course, Sparta installed a governor in the Chalcidice and forced Olynthus into an alliance. But as it would turn out, matters began to take a turn for the worse for Sparta. Theban exiles that had fled to Athens began to hatch a plan to retake their city. They were promised assistance from Athenian volunteers, not from the government of Athens itself. Xenophon indicates that 6 of these exiles made their way back to Thebes. One of these men arrived at the house of Leontiades. He was the leader of the pro-Spartan faction in Thebes. Leontiades, believing one of the men to be his friend, admitted the contingent into his home, where they immediately set upon him with daggers. Next, they quietly released all of their comrades from prison. And just like that, the Spartans had a full-scale rebellion going on in Thebes. The commander of the Spartan garrison immediately requested reinforcements, but the reinforcements were intercepted by the Athenians and Theban cavalry. After blocking the reinforcements, the Thebans and Athenians advanced against the Acropolis. The Spartan garrison had no choice but to abandon the Acropolis. Sparta condemned the garrison commander to death, and a new army was ordered back to Thebes. An aging Agesilaus declined to lead this new army. Instead, command was given to the young king Cleombrotus. Cleombrotus invaded Theban territory for several weeks, but after a rather inconclusive campaign, Cleombrotus decided to set up a base at Thespiae. He left the Spartan general Sphodrius in command of the garrison at Thespiae. Here the Spartans could keep a watchful eye on Thebes. Xenophon relates that there was a general fear in Thebes. The Spartans were still unbeatable on land, and there were fresh worries Sparta could invade whenever and wherever they pleased. This was especially true since the Spartans were no longer bottled up by Corinth, as they had been in the Corinthian War. Thebes was also concerned that they would have to face Sparta alone, so they resolved to drag Athens back into the conflict. After all, the Athenians who had assisted the Thebans earlier had only been volunteers. Now Thebes needed the unqualified support of all Athens. According to Xenophon, Thebes resorted to a rather interesting tactic. Thebes convinced the Spartan general Sphodrius to launch an attack against Athens, which in turn they hoped would force Athens to enter into a war against Sparta. Sphodrius apparently didn't need a lot of prodding and decided to attack Athens. Seems a little bizarre, but in any event, Sphodrius did just that. He attempted to march by night to seize Piraeus, the famed port of Athens. He miscalculated the length of the march, however, and when the sun rose, he and his army were caught right out in the middle of the plain, still miles away from Piraeus. With the element of surprise now lost, Sphodrius retreated back to Boeotia. The Athenians were outraged at this transgression and seized several Spartan envoys who just so happened to be in Athens at the time. They were released only when the Spartans promised that Sphodrius would be placed on trial. Back in Sparta, however, Agesilaus used his influence to secure Sphodrius' acquittal. Agesilaus justified the acquittal by saying, quote, "It is a hard thing to put to death one who as a young man has consistently acted well and honorably, for Sparta has need of such soldiers." Athens, of course, was outraged at the acquittal. It was clear that the relationship between Athens and Sparta was falling apart yet again, especially since it was evident that Athens favored Thebes. This was finally officially made clear when an alliance was struck between Athens and Thebes in 378 BC. By the way, Agesilaus, along with Sphodrius and Phoebus, are seen as maintaining an aggressive Spartan foreign policy that alienated other states throughout Greece. The Spartans now decided to ask Agesilaus to lead the army, and this time Agesilaus decided to accept. Agesilaus planned to occupy Mount Kithaeron. Kithaeron was the physical boundary between Boeotia in the north and Attica in the south. Here the Spartans could establish a base from which they could attack Thebes anytime they pleased. After seizing Kithaeron, Agesilaus descended into the plain and started ravaging the territory around Thebes. As the summer campaign season came to a close, he placed Phoebus in charge of Thespiae, which was the main Spartan base in Boeotia. Phoebus was in charge of mostly mercenary troops and the Thespian army. Notice here we are talking about mercenaries. Increasingly, the Spartans were hiring out mercenaries to fill the gaps. Also, allies were expected to provide troops. If allies could not provide soldiers, then they were expected to provide money to Sparta. Sparta could then use this money to hire out mercenaries. This was needed since the number of pure-blooded Spartiates had been in steady decline since the Peloponnesian War. Okay, so Phoebus conducted regular raids all around Thebes, seizing supplies and harassing the Thebans at every opportunity. The Thebans decided to risk it all and formed up to take on Phoebus. The Theban cavalry was able to rout Sparta's mercenary troops, and Phoebus himself was killed. The Thespian heavy cavalry, who according to Xenophon vowed never to yield to the Thebans, also fled the battlefield. The victory was seen as a turning point and gave the Thebans new resolve in their struggle against Sparta. The Spartans responded by dispatching a new general to take over the garrison at Thespiae. It's important to note that after several of these invasions, the Spartans were unable to put the Thebans out of business, and this would have a huge impact in the years to come. In 377 BC, Sparta yet again decided to launch a new invasion of Boeotia and once again asked Agesilaus to lead. Agesilaus decided to take the same route as before and move through the pass at Mount Kithron. Agesilaus, however, made little progress against the Thebans. The Thebans kept a safe distance away from Agesilaus by establishing fortified positions in the hills. Mainly, they attempted to harass the Spartans. Eventually, Agesilaus made his way back to Thespiae, where he was forced to settle some local disputes between the various factions there. In the following year, Xenophon indicates that Agesilaus was sidelined with an injury to his leg. But this wasn't about to stop Sparta from launching yet another invasion of Thebes. How many more of these are we going to talk about? With Agesilaus out of action, Cleombrotus was placed in charge. But the campaign came to a quick and bitter end as the Spartans found the pass at Mount Kithron blocked by a contingent of Thebans and Athenians. Cleombrotus had no choice but to disband the army and head back to Sparta. Back in Sparta, there was considerable debate about what to do next. The decision was made to outfit a new fleet that would blockade and starve Athens into submission. A fleet of 60 triremes was tasked just for that purpose. With their all-important grain shipments blocked, the Athenian Navy decided to confront the Spartan Navy at sea, and were successful in defeating the Spartans. It is around this time period that many historians consider to be the start of the Second Athenian Empire. The Athenian fleet was again the top navy in Greece, and grain shipments and tributes were pouring in from the different areas around the Aegean Sea. And of course, the walls of Athens had been rebuilt. And if you take a look at this map, this represents the extent of the Second Athenian Empire. Okay, so in 375 BC, Athens and Thebes devised a new strategy. With the sea lanes now open, Athens would raid the Peloponnesus with the hope of keeping Sparta occupied in the defense of her homeland. This in turn would prevent the Spartans from invading Boeotia. The tactic not only worked, but it allowed Thebes to reclaim several cities in Boeotia. During this critical time period, the Thebans were becoming more and more powerful, with many of the cities in Boeotia openly backing the Thebans. The Athenian Navy, meanwhile, reached Corcyra. The Spartans dispatched another fleet of 55 ships. The Athenian Navy in that area numbered around 60 vessels. The battle that ensued was inconclusive, with both sides apparently setting up trophies of victory. While Athens and Sparta were tied up in hostilities, Xenophon states that Thebes had taken over most of the cities in Boeotia, and were now threatening Sparta's ally Phocis. Meanwhile, Athens was growing wary of the Thebans. From Athens' standpoint, they were footing all the costs of the war, while the Thebans were reaping all of the benefits, especially since Thebes had once again overrun most of Boeotia. With that in mind, Athens decided to seek peace with Sparta. A treaty was concluded and the Athenian Navy was ordered home. But then a curious incident occurred. The Athenian Navy, on their way back to Athens, apparently made a landing at an island, which was home to a group of Peloponnesian exiled Democrats. Sparta viewed this as a clear violation of the peace treaty and decided to outfit a new mercenary fleet. This new fleet immediately laid siege to Corcyra. The Corcyrians, of course, appealed to Athens for help. The Athenians decided to send a force to assist. So much for peace. I should mention there is quite a bit of uncertainty about exactly how long the peace really lasted between Sparta and Athens. Xenophon mentions 375 BC, but other ancient chroniclers indicated it lasted several years longer than the short-lived peace that Xenophon seems to imply. So there is quite a bit of uncertainty about the chronology of events during these important years. Okay, so with the war back on, the Athenians appointed none other than Iphicrates to lead the expedition. Iphicrates quickly realized that any voyage around the Peloponnesus was beyond perilous. He would be forced to make landings in hostile territory, at least until he reached Corcyra. But no task was ever too small for Iphicrates, and so he began to make preparations. He ordered the mainsails for all of his ships to be left behind at the docks. Apparently, Iphicrates wanted to keep his men in finely tuned shape, and so he expected them to row the ships rather than use the mainsails. Hopefully, Iphicrates wasn't forcing his men to row at ramming speed. Iphicrates also perfected the timings of his landings on the Peloponnesian coast. The whole fleet would immediately put to shore for a meal or rest. Special attention was made to set up sentries to sound the alert if enemy forces were spotted. Also, Iphicrates banned campfires which might alert the enemy to his position. Iphicrates never lingered on land too long, and by the time local forces became aware of his presence, Iphicrates had already put out to sea. It was a very well organized and well-timed expedition, so well managed that the Spartans were unable to stop Iphicrates from sailing around the Peloponnesus. Meanwhile, the Spartan mercenary army had Corcyra under a horrific siege of starvation. But the Spartan general on the spot apparently decided the city's fall was a foregone conclusion, and for some strange reason, probably greed, decided not to pay his mercenaries. Well, that's never a good idea. The mercenaries were all too aware that the Spartan general had more than enough money to pay his troops. The Corcyrians took notice that the Spartan mercenaries were literally letting down their guard, and seized the opportunity to launch an attack. The Spartan general formed up in battle formation, but by this point, many of his mercenaries had deserted him. The Corcyrians were able to rout the remnants that remained loyal to Sparta. In a last-ditch attempt, the Spartan fleet decided to recover any troops and equipment that had been left behind on the island. But panic set in as the recovery was botched, as there were fears that Iphicrates was about to show up at any moment. Iphicrates and his 70 ships eventually did make it to Corcyra. News reached Iphicrates that another Spartan fleet was on its way. Iphicrates, as always, seized the initiative and sailed out to meet the Spartan fleet. It was a one-sided affair as he succeeded in capturing almost all of the enemy vessels. In some cases, entire ships and crews were captured. Iphicrates transported all of the prisoners and ships back to Corcyra. Here he demanded large ransoms for all of the troops he had taken prisoner. By this time, both the Spartans and Athenians were again war-weary. In Athens, there was a renewed push for peace in 371 BC. A delegation was sent to Sparta to propose peace in front of the Spartan assembly. Sparta decided to accept the Athenian offer. Here were the terms. Governors would be removed from cities. The navies would be disbanded. And there was yet another guarantee of independence for Greek cities. Even the Thebans initially accepted the terms of the peace treaty. But the following day, the leader of the Theban delegation, Epaminondas, insisted that Thebes would only sign the treaty for all of Boeotia. This would maintain the integrity of the Boeotian League. Now, what changed overnight for the Thebans? Well, I think what happened here is that Spartan seizure of the Theban Acropolis years earlier was still burned into the memory of Epaminondas. Now, if the Thebans allowed Sparta to disassemble the Boeotian League for a second time, what was to prevent the Spartans from once again attacking Thebes? And maybe the Thebans wouldn't be so lucky the second time around. Perhaps their city would be razed to the ground. I think Epaminondas must have thought it's now or never. We have the Boeotian League intact, so this is the last best chance we have to take on Sparta. Not surprisingly, Agesilaus, however, refused and stated flatly that Thebes could be removed from the peace treaty altogether if they wished. What a typical Spartan response. Sign the damn document or get the hell out of here. No in between. Now, if cooler heads had prevailed, maybe both sides could have worked something out. Maybe Thebes could have retained control of a couple of cities. But that was never really the manner in which the Spartans conducted business. Agree with us, or it's war. And so Thebes left Sparta without a formal treaty. This puts Sparta and Thebes on another collision course, and we will get to that in the next lecture.